The eternal struggle of Rome and Carthage. In the long memory of the Mediterranean, few rivalries have left a mark so enduring as that between Rome and Carthage. For centuries, the Great Sea had carried the ambitions of traders, settlers, and kings. On its northern shore, the Roman Republic was rising, an inland people, disciplined in arms, bound by the austere codes of Senate and citizen. On the southern coast, Carthage flourished, a seafaring city of Phoenician descent, steeped in commerce, adorned with harbors, and protected by walls that had never fallen. They did not begin as enemies. Rome expanded across Italy, while Carthage guarded its trade across the western seas. But history has a way of drawing powerful rivals closer, until the space between them becomes a question of survival. In the 3rd century before our era, their fates collided. What followed was not one war, but 3, stretched over more than 100 years. Each conflict more bitter, more costly than the last. What followed became known as the Punic Wars, conflicts shaped by legions and war elephants, by treacherous mountain crossings and fierce storms at sea. These wars were forged by childhood oaths, tested by loyalty, and remembered in cities burned in the name of peace. It is a story shaped by ambition, but carried forward by people, generals, citizens, mercenaries, and statesmen. Their decisions would determine the fate not only of their own cities, but of the world to come. Let us begin, then, at the edge of that first confrontation, in the shadow of Sicily, before the names Hannibal and Scipio were yet known to history. A calm before the storm. The Mediterranean sun rose gently over the shimmering waters, bathing Sicily's coasts and cliffs in a warm golden light. From the rocky heights of Carthage to the bustling streets of Rome, the great powers of the Western world stirred with ambition. On one side stood mighty Carthage, a proud maritime empire built on commerce, trade, and seaborne dominance. On the other, Rome, a rising republic forged in land wars, yet newly drawn to the lure of the sea. Though their paths had only lightly crossed in the past, by the middle of the 3rd century BCE, their destinies were converging. A collision was inevitable, driven by the ambitions of two peoples who could no longer ignore one another's presence across the sea. At this moment, Carthage appeared secure. Its influence stretched across North Africa, southern Iberia, and key islands like Sardinia and western Sicily. Wealth flowed into Carthage's harbors from every corner of the Mediterranean, carried by ships piloted by generations of expert sailors. The city's oligarchic council, a blend of merchant princes and nobles, governed an empire sustained by hired mercenaries. These soldiers of fortune, Libyans, Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, fought for Carthage's coin, not its soil. In contrast, Rome's strength was rooted in the soil of Italy itself. Its armies were drawn from citizen soldiers, each bound by duty and tradition to serve the Republic. Glory in battle meant not only honor for the individual, but prestige for the family, advancement in politics, and the promise of enduring legacy. Rome was governed by the Senate, a powerful assembly of patrician elites and ambitious plebeians who saw military conquest as both destiny and duty. Rome's leaders believed they had tamed Italy. From the Sabines to the Samnites, from Etruria to Campania, Rome had subjugated nearly all who dwelt on the peninsula. With Italy under its sway, Rome's gaze inevitably turned outward, toward the islands that dotted the blue expanse of the Tyrrhenian Sea, and most importantly, toward Sicily. Sicily lay at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, a fertile land rich in resources and coveted by all who sailed nearby. Its cities reflected the diversity of the region itself. Greek colonies like Syracuse and Agrigentum, Phoenician outposts, native Sicel settlements. For generations, Carthage had held sway over western Sicily, establishing bases at Lilybaeum and Motia, and extending its influence over native tribes. But while Carthage held much of western Sicily, the eastern half remained fiercely independent, with Greek cities often divided in loyalty or embroiled in rivalry. This delicate balance created fertile ground for discord, and the spark that would ignite the coming war came from Messana, at the island's northeastern corner. Messana had fallen into the hands of the Mamertines, a band of Italian mercenaries who, having seized the city, ruled it like pirates. Beset by Syracuse on one side and Carthage on the other, the Mamertines sought help. At first they courted Carthage, who sent a garrison to protect the strategic port. But soon, fearing Carthaginian dominance, they appealed instead to Rome. This appeal reached the Roman Senate in 264 BCE and sparked intense debate. Some senators warned against intervention, pointing out that Rome had no tradition of overseas war and that Carthage's naval power was supreme. But others, particularly among the younger and more ambitious faction, saw opportunity. If Rome could establish itself in Messana, it could challenge Carthage's influence throughout Sicily, and from there perhaps dominate the entire Western Mediterranean. In the end, ambition won out. Rome resolved to send a force to Messana, marking the first time Roman legions would cross the sea and wage war outside Italy. And so it was that Roman troops disembarked on Sicilian shores. To the Carthaginians, this act was a provocation too great to ignore. They responded quickly, reinforcing their positions in Sicily and preparing for confrontation. The situation escalated rapidly. What had begun as a local affair involving a pirate garrison now drew in two superpowers, both determined to assert their dominance. For the Romans, landing at Messana was more than a military maneuver. It was a psychological transformation. Until this point, Rome had been a land empire, expanding its influence step by step across Italian hills and plains. Now it was stepping onto a new stage entirely, the wide and unpredictable arena of the Mediterranean Sea. This change did not go unnoticed. Ancient historians like Polybius saw the Roman intervention in Messana as the start of something larger, a fundamental shift in Rome's identity from an Italian power to a Mediterranean one. Livy, writing for later Roman audiences, would emphasize the Senate's boldness and the Republic's sense of destiny, framing this decision as the beginning of Rome's inevitable rise to empire. The contrast between Rome and Carthage could not have been clearer. Carthage was a naval empire, experienced in commerce, diplomacy, and maritime war. Its forces were cosmopolitan, drawn from lands across the Mediterranean, but united only by contracts and coin. Rome's soldiers, by contrast, were citizens who fought for honor, family, and the Republic itself. Their loyalty was profound and their discipline unmatched. This divergence reflected deeper cultural differences too. Carthage had long favored pragmatic diplomacy, carefully calculated influence, and alliances shaped by trade. Rome, in contrast, was animated by ideology. War was not merely an instrument of policy, but a crucible for proving Roman virtue. As Carthaginian and Roman forces squared off around Messana, their opposing philosophies became apparent not just in their soldiers' composition, but in their strategies. Carthage sought to encircle and contain Rome's foothold, confident that superior seamanship and resources would wear the invaders down. Rome, determined and unyielding, sought quick confrontation, aiming to force a decision on the battlefield. The skirmishes that followed were small but portentous. Roman discipline and aggressive tactics allowed them to seize ground and reinforce their positions, while Carthaginian commanders hesitated, wary of being drawn into costly engagements far from their naval bases. As the months passed, Messana became a symbol, a microcosm of the broader conflict taking shape. For both sides, the city's fate had grown into a test of prestige and legitimacy. Rome's successful defense of Messana emboldened the Senate to think even more boldly. With their foothold secure, they began planning campaigns deeper into Sicily, targeting Agrigentum and other Carthaginian-aligned cities. But while Rome celebrated its early victories, the Senate also recognized the vulnerability of their position. Carthage still controlled the seas. Roman supply lines stretched thin across the Strait of Messina, vulnerable to Carthaginian naval interception. This realization led to a remarkable decision, one that would define Rome's trajectory for the rest of the war and beyond. Rome would not rely on coastal bases alone. It would build a navy. From this quiet but profound resolution, a new era began. Roman shipyards bustled as engineers and craftsmen worked day and night to construct vessels modeled on captured Carthaginian designs. The Senate invested resources and manpower on a scale unprecedented in Roman history, all to meet a challenge that would have seemed impossible a generation before. In this transformation, the character of Rome was revealed again: pragmatic, adaptable, and relentless. Rome had crossed a line, physically and politically. In securing Messana, she had not merely aided a desperate ally, but declared her intent to stand toe-to-toe with the greatest naval power of the age. Across the waters, Carthage stirred. Surprised, perhaps, but not unprepared. The stage was set, and the winds of war had begun to rise. From a skirmish in a single Sicilian city, an era of conflict was awakening, one that would stretch across continents and reshape the destiny of empires neither Rome nor Carthage could yet grasp the scale of what had begun. What seemed in that moment a local conflict born of chance and urgency would stretch into decades of warfare, changing not only borders, but the very rhythm of the ancient world. From these early steps would emerge a new Mediterranean order, and with it, the foundations of a Roman dominion that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. The Siege of Agrigentum. With Messana secured and Roman banners fluttering proudly above its walls, Rome's resolve hardened. What had begun as a limited intervention was now transforming into something greater, a campaign to assert dominance across Sicily and, by extension, the Western Mediterranean. And as Rome looked deeper into the island, its gaze fell upon a city whose capture would send a powerful message to friend and foe alike: Agrigentum. Agrigentum, known to the Greeks as Akragas, was no ordinary settlement. Perched atop a ridge along Sicily's southern coast, its walls had withstood the ambitions of past conquerors. Rich in grain and wealth, it represented both a strategic fortress and a symbol of Carthaginian influence. Since the 4th century BCE, Carthage had used Agrigentum as a keystone of its Sicilian holdings. Now it was about to become the first major test of Rome's will, far from Italian soil. The decision to besiege Agrigentum was not made lightly. Roman consuls Lucius Postumius, Megellus, and Quintus Mamilius Vitalis understood that a successful siege would not only weaken Carthage's grip on Sicily, but also demonstrate that Rome could sustain warfare abroad, a profound shift in the Republic's military identity. Preparations began quickly. Thousands of legionaries marched from Messana, joined by engineers, supply caravans, and eager young officers, eager to prove themselves in this new theater of war. Agrigentum's defenders were led by Hannibal Gisco, a Carthaginian commander known for his pragmatism and caution. He understood that his orders were clear: hold Agrigentum at all costs. If this city fell, the psychological blow to Carthage's position in Sicily would be immense. Inside the city walls, Carthaginian engineers reinforced battlements, stored grain, and prepared for a siege that might stretch into months. As Roman troops arrived on the heights overlooking the city, they moved with the discipline that had become their hallmark. Camps were established, trenches dug, watchtowers erected. Soon, a ring of fortifications encircled Agrigentum. The siege had begun. At first, the Romans expected a swift result. Their forces were superior in number, and their siege engines, battering rams, catapults, and towers, were well supplied. But Agrigentum's walls held firm, and its defenders resisted fiercely. Weeks turned into months. Under the searing Sicilian sun, disease began to spread in the Roman camps. Food grew scarce as Carthaginian cavalry, operating from nearby outposts, harassed Roman foragers and cut supply lines. Inside Agrigentum, morale wavered but did not break. Hannibal Gisco knew that time was his ally. The longer he held out, the more likely it became that Carthage would send reinforcements to lift the siege. And indeed, far across the island, word had reached Carthage of Agrigentum's plight. A relief force was assembled under the command of General Hanno, a seasoned soldier determined to turn the tide. Hanno's army included not only mercenaries from North Africa and Iberia, but also a core of Carthage's most fearsome assets, war elephants. These massive beasts, symbols of Carthaginian power, were meant to inspire fear and shatter enemy lines. As Hanno approached Agrigentum's outskirts, the Romans were faced with a grave dilemma. Should they maintain their siege, knowing their forces were weakening, or turn to confront the relieving army directly? In a moment of both necessity and boldness, the Roman consuls chose the latter. The battle that followed was brutal. Roman legions, veterans of land combat but unused to facing elephants, found themselves tested as never before. The elephants charged first, their riders urging them forward with sharp cries and goads. Roman soldiers braced their spears and formed tight ranks. Some elephants crashed into the front lines, throwing men aside. Others veered in panic as Roman missiles struck home. Behind the elephants came Hanno's infantry, Libyan spearmen, Iberian swordsmen, Numidian skirmishers, all determined to break the Roman lines. The clash was fierce, chaotic, and deadly. And yet Roman discipline held. With careful coordination and courage, they turned the tide. Elephants that survived the first assault became liabilities as they trampled their own allies in confusion. Carthaginian mercenaries, seeing the tide turn, began to falter. As evening fell, the Roman legions stood victorious. Hanno's army retreated in disorder, leaving Agrigentum isolated once more. The defenders within the city recognized their fate was sealed. Hannibal Gisco, unwilling to surrender or fall into Roman hands, made a daring escape under cover of night, slipping through enemy lines with a small contingent of men. The next morning, the gates were breached, and Roman soldiers poured into Agrigentum. The aftermath was grim but predictable. The city was looted, its treasures carried away, and thousands of its inhabitants enslaved, a stark warning to any Sicilian city contemplating resistance. For Rome, this was a moment of triumph. The siege of Agrigentum had tested every aspect of the Republic's newfound ambition: logistical coordination, endurance far from home, the ability to adapt to unfamiliar enemies like elephants and mercenaries. Victory was proof that Rome could wage sustained war abroad, but the price had been high. The losses from battle, disease, and supply shortages weighed heavily on the consuls and their legions. Moreover, the Romans recognized that while they had defeated Carthage's land forces at Agrigentum, they remained vulnerable in a different dimension altogether: the sea. Even as Roman troops celebrated in the streets of Agrigentum, Carthaginian ships still dominated the surrounding waters. Rome's supply lines remained precarious, and any sustained campaign would require maritime security, a lesson the Senate in Rome understood all too well. And so, while Agrigentum fell, plans for the next phase of the war took shape. Not only campaigns to capture other Carthaginian-held cities, but also preparations for the construction of a navy that could challenge Carthage's maritime dominance. This was a subtle but profound shift. Until now, Rome had been a land power, secure in its mastery of infantry tactics and battlefield discipline. The conquest of Agrigentum revealed that victory in Sicily would demand mastery of the sea as well. Historians like Polybius, writing generations later, would recognize this as a turning point not only in the First Punic War, but in Rome's identity itself. No longer confined to the Italian mainland, the Republic was now becoming a Mediterranean power, a people who would soon come to view the entire sea as their natural sphere of influence. Modern scholars, too, have reflected on this transformation. Richard Miles emphasizes how the siege demonstrated Rome's strategic patience and adaptability, while Adrian Goldsworthy notes that Agrigentum's fall foreshadowed a Roman determination to learn and master every aspect of warfare, on land, at sea, and in the corridors of diplomacy. And for the people of Sicily, the fall of Agrigentum was a stark signal that Rome was here to stay. Greek cities like Syracuse began to reconsider their allegiances. Smaller towns debated whether to resist or accommodate this rising power from across the strait. In the aftermath of Agrigentum, a deceptive calm settled over the island. Rome had proven it could carry war across the sea, endure siege and suffering, and emerge triumphant. Carthage, though wounded, still held the coast, its fleets unbroken, its harbors fortified. Yet beneath this quiet, the tide was shifting. For Rome, Sicily was no longer merely a distant battleground or a stage for allied disputes. It had become a crucible of empire, a proving ground for destiny. The fall of Agrigentum had opened more than city gates. It had opened the Senate's imagination. What once lay beyond Sicily shimmered now, not as boundary, but as invitation. Rome had stepped onto a greater stage, and neither storm, setback, nor loss would turn it back. From Agrigentum's fallen walls, the Republic looked outward, not just across Sicily, but across the sea, to a horizon filled with promise and peril alike. And so the war, far from ending, began to deepen. Rome at sea. The dust of Agrigentum had barely settled when Rome faced a sobering realization. The victory on land was impressive, but Carthage's true power did not lie in garrisons or Sicilian cities. It lay upon the sea. As Roman soldiers settled into their new outposts and watched the blue waters beyond, the Senate in Rome grasped an uncomfortable truth. If Rome was to win this war, it must do so not only on land, but also at sea. And so, quietly but decisively, began one of the most remarkable transformations in military history. A land-based republic without naval tradition, preparing to challenge a maritime empire in its natural element. By the early 260s BCE, Carthage's navy was the largest and most experienced in the Mediterranean. Carthaginian ships, sleek and fast, manned by seasoned crews, dominated trade routes and could move troops and supplies swiftly across the sea. Rome, in contrast, had no fleet to speak of. Its merchants sailed modest vessels suitable for coastal trading, but it possessed neither the ships nor the seafaring experience required for naval war. Yet Rome's senators, emboldened by their victory at Agrigentum, resolved to build a fleet from scratch, a decision that many ancient observers, including Polybius, considered bold if not reckless. This was a republic that had only recently marched across Italy. Now it was preparing to sail far from its shores. At first, the Romans did what they did best. They studied their enemy. A wrecked Carthaginian quinquereme, a heavy warship with 5 banks of oars, was recovered and carefully examined. Roman shipwrights, more familiar with rivercraft and merchant hulls, copied the design plank for plank, rivet for rivet. Within months, they began building not 1 or 2 ships, but an entire fleet. And yet, even as wood was cut and nails hammered into place, doubts lingered. What use was a fleet without sailors? How could a nation whose citizens had barely taken to the sea stand against Carthage's veteran mariners? Here, Roman ingenuity revealed itself again. Rather than attempting to match Carthage's seamanship, Rome would reimagine the very nature of naval combat. Their answer came in the form of the corvus, a boarding device, essentially a movable gangplank, with a spike on its underside. When lowered onto an enemy ship, it would pin the 2 vessels together, allowing Roman legionaries to do what they excelled at, close quarters combat. With the corvus, Rome transformed naval battle into something akin to a land battle fought on wooden decks. As Rome prepared this new fleet, Carthage remained watchful. The loss of Agrigentum had been a blow to its prestige, but Carthage's admirals knew the sea was their element. They assumed that Rome's attempt to build a navy would end in embarrassment. After all, how could land soldiers hope to sail, let alone fight, against men born to the waves? In 260 BCE, the 2 navies met off the coast of Mylae in northern Sicily. It was a calm day, the sea reflecting the sky's pale blue. Carthage's ships, confident and agile, advanced in disciplined formation. Rome's fleet, newly built and crewed by inexperienced sailors, moved awkwardly by comparison. But as the Carthaginians closed in, they discovered Rome's innovation. The corvus swung down with deadly force, locking Roman ships to their adversaries. Once the decks became fields of battle, the Roman infantry's superiority was decisive. What began as a mismatch ended as a stunning victory for Rome. Over 30 Carthaginian ships were captured, their proud banners replaced by Roman standards. The consul Gaius Duilius, commanding the Roman fleet, returned to Rome in triumph, a rare honor for a naval commander in a city that had traditionally honored land victories. The psychological impact was as profound as the military result. Rome had proven that it could fight and win at sea. Carthage's aura of invincibility had been punctured. And though the war remained far from over, this victory tilted the balance, showing Rome that mastery of the Mediterranean was within its reach. Meanwhile, Carthage regrouped. The admirals recognized that Roman use of the corvus had neutralized their seamanship advantage. Carthaginian shipbuilders began redesigning their ships for speed and maneuverability, hoping to outflank the cumbersome Roman fleets. In Sicily, land operations continued as well. The Roman and Carthaginian armies fought a series of smaller engagements along the coastlines, vying for control of ports and strongholds that could supply their fleets. Amidst this growing struggle, observers across the Mediterranean began to appreciate the magnitude of what was unfolding. The First Punic War was no longer a contest over a few Sicilian cities. It was becoming a war to determine which power would dominate the Western Mediterranean for generations. Polybius would later write that this period was where Rome's transformation truly began, not merely in shipbuilding or battlefield tactics, but in ambition itself. The war revealed to Roman leaders that their destiny extended beyond Italy, that they could project power across seas as well as land. The historian Richard Miles, in his modern analysis, sees this moment as a cultural turning point too. The Roman mindset shifted from one of cautious expansion to a worldview where Rome saw itself as the inevitable master of all territories, touching the Mediterranean shores. And so, the Roman people, merchants, senators, and generals alike began to think in new terms. Sicily was no longer simply a neighbor's island. It was the first stepping stone in Rome's vision of Mare Nostrum, our sea. Even as this vision took hold, there were quieter reflections too. In taverns and workshops, veterans of Mylais recounted how terrifying it had been to fight on unfamiliar decks, to feel ships rocking beneath their feet, to battle not only Carthaginians, but also the vast, unpredictable sea itself. This mix of awe and ambition filled Rome's streets and temples. Sacrifices were offered to Neptune for safe passage. New training regimens were devised for sailors. Dockyards in Ostia, previously quiet, now hummed with constant activity as carpenters, blacksmiths, and rope makers labored day and night. Rome that has learned it can build fleets and fight at sea. A Carthage that recognizes its old advantages are slipping, and a Mediterranean transformed from a highway of commerce into a theater of total war. And yet, beneath all the noise of war drums and hammering dockyards, a quieter realization emerges. This is just the beginning. Rome's first naval victories do not end the war. They mark the opening of a new phase, a phase in which sea battles will decide the fate of empires and test not only ships and men, but also the resilience and imagination of two very different civilizations. Storms, setbacks, and resolve. After Rome's bold victory at Mylais, a fresh optimism swept through the Republic. For the first time in its history, Rome had defeated Carthage at sea. Senators who had once doubted the wisdom of naval war now spoke of new horizons, and young officers dreamed not of marches over hills but of voyages across seas. But history, as it often does, would temper that early confidence with harsh lessons. The Mediterranean, beautiful and bountiful, could also be cruel. Even as Roman dockyards expanded and consuls planned further campaigns, a reminder of nature's power loomed on the horizon. Rome's new fleet, freshly built, ambitious, and numerous, soon set sail again, this time aiming for Sardinia and Corsica, Carthaginian-held islands west of Italy. The Senate's strategy was to deny Carthage its maritime strongholds and choke its trade routes. If Sicily was the stage, the broader Mediterranean was fast becoming the arena. In the summer of 255 BCE, the Roman fleet, numbering hundreds of ships, began its return journey from a successful raid along the North African coast. The expedition had been daring and yielded considerable spoils. But even as ships sailed under bright banners and jubilant captains, ominous winds rose. What happened next became legendary in Roman annals, a disaster not from enemy action, but from the sea itself. A violent storm, sudden and merciless, descended upon the Roman fleet off the southern coast of Sicily. Gale-force winds howled, waves battered the wooden hulls. Roman ships, heavy with plunder and prisoners, were ill-prepared for such fury. As Polybius later recorded, hundreds of ships were wrecked. More than 100,000 men, sailors, soldiers, and slaves, perished in the waves or washed ashore on foreign sands. In a single tempestuous night, Rome's fledgling naval supremacy was all but erased. The news when it reached Rome was devastating. The Senate mourned the dead, comforted bereaved families, and debated whether their new maritime ambitions had been reckless. Many senators argued for caution, even withdrawal. Yet here, in this moment of crisis, the character of Rome revealed itself. Instead of retreating, Rome rebuilt. Almost immediately, shipyards once more rang with hammers and saws. Trees from distant forests were felled and transported down rivers to Ostia. New ships were laid down, not fewer but in greater number. Rome had lost an entire fleet, but it resolved to raise another. This remarkable resilience bewildered Carthage. Their admirals had hoped the storm would dampen Roman ambitions, that the Republic would shy away from further naval ventures. But Carthage underestimated Roman tenacity. Where Carthage preferred calculated diplomacy and measured war, Rome embraced determination, viewing setbacks not as reasons for withdrawal, but as calls to greater effort. As Rome rebuilt, Carthage sought its own opportunities. The Punic generals planned to retake lost Sicilian strongholds, raiding Roman-held ports and sending fast-moving squadrons to disrupt supply lines. On the island itself, the balance of power remained delicate. Carthaginian forces, though fewer, maintained control over several key fortresses on Sicily's western coast, notably Lilybaeum and Drepana. The next major confrontation came in 249 BCE at Drepana, a vital port and one of Carthage's last strongholds on Sicily. Roman consul Publius Claudius Pulcher led a massive fleet to seize the harbor, hoping to deliver a knockout blow that would finally break Carthaginian resistance. Pulcher was a man of boldness, but also of hubris. Before the battle, Roman tradition dictated consulting omens by observing sacred chickens. According to legend, when the birds refused to eat, a bad omen, Pulcher dismissed the warning by throwing them into the sea, declaring, "If they will not eat, let them drink." The gods, it seemed, took offense. The battle began with Roman ships advancing into the harbor in poor formation, uncoordinated and overconfident. Carthaginian Admiral Adherbal, observing from shore, ordered his faster, more maneuverable ships to encircle the Roman fleet. What followed was a humiliating rout. Roman ships became trapped, their cumbersome movements betraying their inexperience. Carthaginian sailors exploited every weakness, their familiarity with the currents and coastal winds giving them further advantage. At Drepana, Rome lost over 90 ships, and Pulcher fled the scene. A defeat as complete as Mylae had been a triumph. News of this disaster shook Rome profoundly. It had not simply lost ships, it had lost prestige and confidence. The Senate convened emergency sessions, questioning commanders and debating whether their ambitions in Sicily had outstripped their means. Yet once again, Roman resilience prevailed. Even as some senators argued for peace, the majority agreed that defeat at Drepana did not negate their broader goals. Rather than sue for peace, they planned for yet another rebuilding. What mattered, they believed, was not that Rome had suffered losses, but that Rome had not yet finished what it had begun. Carthage, for its part, now sensed opportunity. Its leaders knew they could not match Rome indefinitely in manpower or resources, but they could exploit Roman overreach and weariness. Their strategy shifted toward protracted warfare, using fortresses like Lilybaeum as bastions of endurance, drawing Rome deeper into conflict and waiting for exhaustion to sap the Republic's will. For years, the conflict settled into this uneasy stalemate. Roman legions besieged Carthaginian strongholds on land. Carthaginian squadrons harried Roman convoys at sea. Neither side could deliver a decisive blow. Through these years, subtle shifts were underway. Rome, learning from each defeat and setback, improved its ships, refined naval tactics, and deepened its understanding of maritime logistics. Carthage, meanwhile, struggled with internal divisions. Factions in its council debated the cost of the war, and mercenaries complained of unpaid wages. As historians such as Adrian Goldsworthy and Richard Miles later observed, this phase of the war demonstrated two contrasting approaches to empire. Carthage clung to its naval traditions, emphasizing seaborne raids and avoiding direct confrontation whenever possible. Rome, by contrast, transformed itself relentlessly, adapting, innovating, and never ceasing its pursuit of victory. By 243 BCE, Rome prepared yet another fleet, this one larger, faster, and better trained than any that had come before. The Senate, determined to end the stalemate, authorized its most ambitious naval campaign yet. Shipwrights in Ostia and other ports worked tirelessly. New recruits were trained not as sailors alone, but as soldiers of the sea. This was no longer a Rome that feared maritime war. This was a Rome that had embraced the sea as another battlefield, a Rome that viewed setbacks as steps toward eventual triumph. From the triumph at Mylae to the humiliation at Drepana, From tempests that swallowed ships whole to sieges that bled armies dry, Rome had tasted the full bitterness of ambition. The sea had battered her. Carthage had struck back with fury. Even the gods, it seemed, had grown silent. And yet she endured. What began as a campaign for Sicily was transforming into something far greater, a contest of endurance, vision, and will. Rome had come to learn that empire would not be seized in a single stroke, but earned in the long shadow of suffering. The Mediterranean now held its breath once more. What began as a conflict over a small Sicilian city had evolved into a war of attrition, a struggle that would determine not only who controlled Sicily, but who would rule the entire Western Mediterranean for generations to come. Rome and Carthage had both shown brilliance and folly, courage and arrogance. The final outcome still lay beyond the horizon, but as every sailor and soldier knew, the next campaign would be decisive. The war at sea deepens. In the years following Rome's humbling defeat at Drepana, the rhythm of the First Punic War settled into a bitter stalemate. The seas around Sicily swirled with danger, where Carthaginian ships, still dominant, patrolled and harassed Roman supply routes. On land, Roman legions held what ground they could, but their ambition to subdue the entire island seemed just beyond reach. It was an uneasy balance, one where both sides tested each other, but neither could yet deliver a decisive blow. In Rome, the Senate found itself at a crossroads. The losses at Drepana and the preceding storms had devastated the Republic's naval strength, and some voices urged caution, even withdrawal. But these voices were soon drowned out by those who understood what was truly at stake. Rome could not simply defend its holdings in Sicily. To defeat Carthage, Rome needed to control the sea. And so, once again, the shipyards of Ostia and beyond came alive with the sounds of hammers, saws, and shouted orders. New fleets were laid down, faster ships this time, better designed for maneuver and combat. The Corvus boarding device, which had served well in earlier encounters, was reconsidered. Roman naval architects realized its weight made their ships unwieldy in rough waters. A new approach was needed. This gradual refinement, born of hard lessons and steep costs, reflected the very spirit of Roman resilience. Every loss was studied. Every defeat yielded lessons. Rome's genius was not always in innovation, but in adaptation, learning quickly, relentlessly, and with purpose. As Roman fleets prepared to return to Sicily's waters, Carthage did not sit idle. Its admirals understood that time was on their side. The longer the war dragged on, the greater the strain on Roman resources and morale. From their fortified ports at Lilybaeum and Drepana, Carthaginian squadrons launched swift, daring raids against Roman coastal positions and supply convoys. These raids were not designed to conquer, but to frustrate, to keep Rome off balance, to drain her coffers, and to sow doubt among her commanders. And yet Rome pressed forward. In 243 BCE, after years of preparation, Rome launched a fleet larger and better trained than any before it. The Senate entrusted command to Gaius Lutatius Catulus, a man whose steady hand and methodical mind reflected the careful planning that had gone into this new campaign. Catulus's objective was clear: to blockade Lilybaeum, Carthage's primary stronghold on Sicily's western tip. If Lilybaeum could be isolated, Rome would finally break Carthage's grip on the island. The siege of Lilybaeum became one of the defining episodes of the First Punic War. Roman engineers constructed massive siege works, towers that loomed over the city's walls, earthworks stretching across its approaches, and fortified camps that encircled the entire settlement. Yet even as the Romans dug in, Carthaginian blockade runners slipped through gaps in the encirclement, bringing food, weapons, and hope to the defenders. It was a frustrating endeavor. Roman soldiers, weary from years of war, watched as small Carthaginian vessels darted into Lilybaeum's harbor under cover of night or fog. Every day the siege continued. The cost in supplies, manpower, and morale grew heavier. But beneath this slow grind, Rome was changing. In harbors along the Italian coast, a new generation of sailors trained ceaselessly, not just in rowing, but in maneuvering, boarding drills, and coordinated naval tactics. Roman commanders learned to time their departures with favorable winds, to read the coastal currents, and to think like seafarers. Slowly but surely, the imbalance at sea began to narrow. Even as Lilybaeum resisted, Rome's eyes turned to another prize, the Carthaginian fleet itself. To win this war decisively, Rome would have to defeat Carthage at sea, not just in isolated engagements, but in a final, crushing battle. In 241 BCE, that opportunity arrived. After years of siege and attrition, Carthage's Senate resolved to send a relief fleet to Sicily. The objective was bold: break the siege at Lilybaeum, resupply its garrison, and reassert Carthaginian naval dominance. The fleet, hastily assembled, included newly built ships and many inexperienced crews, but Carthage's leaders believed the gamble was necessary. Without Lilybaeum, their foothold in Sicily would collapse. Catullus, informed by scouts and intelligence gathered over months, anticipated this move. He prepared his fleet carefully, drilling his sailors and refining his battle plans. Unlike in earlier battles, the Roman ships were now leaner, faster, and crewed by men seasoned by bitter experience. The two fleets met near the Aegates Islands, a scattering of rocky isles off Sicily's western coast. The morning of battle dawned clear and calm, the sea a vast mirror reflecting the enormity of what was about to unfold. For Carthage, the approach was fraught with problems. Their ships were heavily laden with supplies intended for Lilybaeum, making them slow and less maneuverable. Many of their crews were untested in combat. Catullus seized the initiative. As the Carthaginian fleet struggled to form a coherent line of battle, the Roman ships swept in with discipline and confidence. No longer dependent on the corvus, the Romans fought as sailors and soldiers both, ramming, boarding, and overwhelming their foes with precision. The battle that followed was swift but decisive. The Carthaginian line collapsed. Over 50 ships were sunk, many more were captured. Survivors fled the field, retreating toward Carthage with news of yet another catastrophic defeat. The victory at the Aegates Islands was more than a naval triumph. It was the culmination of years of struggle, adaptation, and unrelenting resolve. With its fleet shattered, Carthage no longer had the means to sustain its armies in Sicily. Negotiations began almost immediately. In Rome, the news was met with celebration and relief. The long war, which had drained the Republic's treasury and bled its armies, was finally approaching its end. The Senate, mindful of both triumph and cost, dictated harsh terms. Carthage would evacuate Sicily entirely, cede its claims to Sardinia and Corsica, pay a substantial indemnity over 10 years, and accept Roman naval supremacy. These terms reflected Rome's understanding that this had not been merely a war for territory, it had been a war for control of the sea itself. As the dust settled and treaties were signed, Sicily became Rome's first province outside Italy, a stepping stone toward further expansion. The transformation that had begun at Messana was now complete. Rome was no longer a regional power. She had emerged as a Mediterranean force, her influence reaching beyond her shores for the first time. In Carthage, the defeat at the Aegates Islands was devastating, but the pain of the loss would fester into something deeper, a bitter desire for revenge, one that would soon find voice in the next generation, in the form of Hannibal Barca. Rome had won the First Punic War, but at immense cost. The Republic's finances were strained, its legions exhausted. The Senate now faced the challenge of governing a faraway island with a diverse and restive population. Carthage, though humbled, remained a proud city with a vast commercial network and distant colonies that still hummed with trade and ambition. Beneath the celebrations and solemn sacrifices offered in Rome's temples, a deeper truth lingered. Peace with Carthage was fragile, and the rivalries that had fueled this war had not been extinguished, merely postponed. The Mediterranean, so long a highway of commerce and culture, had now become a sea contested not only by fleets and armies, but by ideas, what it meant to rule, to endure, and to seek supremacy. The story of Rome and Carthage was far from over. Interlude of uneasy peace. The clash at the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE had brought the First Punic War to its long-awaited close, and across the Mediterranean, a fragile calm settled. For the first time in nearly a quarter century, The fleets of Rome and Carthage no longer crossed paths with swords drawn or rams poised. Messengers carried treaties instead of battle orders, and for a fleeting moment, hope of lasting peace seemed possible. But beneath this calm, both Rome and Carthage were changed, and neither would remain content for long. In Rome, the Senate presided over a new reality. The acquisition of Sicily marked more than just territorial expansion. It represented the Republic's first step beyond the Italian mainland. Sicily became Rome's first province, administered not as an extension of Italy, but as a foreign holding. Governors were appointed, taxes assessed, and garrisons stationed. This administrative experiment, born out of war, laid the foundation for what would become an empire in all but name. Yet peace brought its own burdens. The war had strained Rome's treasury and tested its people's endurance. Thousands of veterans returned home, many to find their farms neglected or their families impoverished. The Senate, ever pragmatic, worked to absorb these shocks, providing land grants to soldiers and asserting tighter control over the Italian heartland to ensure order. For many Roman senators and generals, the war had affirmed something deeper, a sense of destiny. Rome had proved it could not only defend itself, but project power across the sea. Sicily was now Rome's foothold, and with it came the realization that the Republic's future lay beyond Italy's shores. In Carthage, however, the mood was one of bitter reckoning. The terms of the peace treaty had been harsh. Sicily lost, Sardinia and Corsica soon annexed by Rome, in what Carthaginians saw as an opportunistic betrayal and a crushing indemnity that drained Carthage's wealth year after year. These losses exposed fractures within Carthaginian society. The merchant elite, long accustomed to prosperity, resented the demands of tribute to Rome. Mercenaries, whose wages went unpaid after the war, mutinied. The ensuing mercenary war, sometimes called the Truceless War because of its savage brutality, saw Carthage's very survival threatened, not by Rome, but by its own hired soldiers. For 4 harrowing years, from 241 to 237 BCE, Carthage descended into chaos. The mutinous armies laid siege to the city itself, capturing outlying towns and massacring civilians. It was a time of betrayal and revenge, when former comrades became executioners and no quarter was given. Carthage's salvation came from one man, Hamilcar Barca, a veteran commander who had distinguished himself in Sicily, but returned to find his city on the brink of destruction. Ruthless, resourceful, and charismatic, Hamilcar rallied loyalists, crushed the rebellion in a campaign of calculated terror, and restored Carthage's authority. Yet even in victory, Hamilcar's mind turned outward. He recognized that Carthage's strength could no longer rest on its merchant fleets alone. It required new lands, new sources of wealth, and above all, a new generation of warriors loyal not just to Carthage, but to the Barca family itself. His gaze turned west, to Iberia. There, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, lay rich silver mines, fertile plains, and independent tribes ripe for conquest or alliance. Iberia offered both wealth to pay Rome's indemnity and the opportunity to rebuild Carthage's military might, far from Roman interference. In 237 BCE, Hamilcar set sail for Iberia with an army at his back and his young son at his side. A boy named Hannibal, who even then began to learn lessons in command, loyalty, and hatred for Rome. While Carthage rebuilt in Iberia, Rome too faced challenges at home and abroad. The annexation of Sardinia and Corsica, though swift, had drawn Carthaginian protests and nearly reignited war. Only Carthage's weakened state prevented further conflict. In the north, Rome contended with the Ligurians and Gauls, fierce peoples who refused to bow before Roman legions. To the east, its influence began creeping into Illyria and along the Adriatic, where piracy threatened Rome's growing maritime trade. Thus, even in this so-called time of peace, Rome remained restless. Historians like Polybius would later note how these years set the stage for a larger confrontation. Carthage, humiliated but not destroyed, recovered quickly and built a new empire in Iberia under Hamilcar and his successors. Rome, flush with victory and hungry for security, expanded its influence wherever it could, entangling itself in new conflicts and rivalries. Modern scholars reflect on this period as one of transformation, a hinge between wars, where both powers rearmed, redefined their ambitions, and prepared almost unconsciously for the next clash. And amid this interlude, an even more profound transformation unfolded quietly, the shaping of Hannibal himself. As a boy, Hannibal followed his father through Iberian forests and mountains, learning the arts of war firsthand. He watched Hamilcar negotiate with tribal chiefs, lead daring raids, and establish a foothold that would, in time, become Carthage's most valuable possession. Legend holds that before leaving Carthage, Hamilcar brought Hannibal to a sacred altar and made him swear a solemn oath that he would never be a friend to Rome. Whether this story is literal or apocryphal, it captures the essence of what was happening, a generational transfer of hatred, ambition, and purpose. By the time Hamilcar died in battle around 228 BCE, his vision was well on its way to fruition. His son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair continued his work, expanding Carthaginian power throughout Iberia and founding the great city of Carthage, New Carthage, later known as Cartagena. In Rome, senators watched these developments with wary eyes. Though Carthage was bound by treaty to respect the independence of certain Iberian towns, Rome knew that Carthage's growing wealth and influence in the region could, in time, pose a threat. An uneasy equilibrium prevailed, a peace that felt brittle, provisional, and fragile. The Mediterranean is at a quiet simmer. Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica are firmly under Roman control, but Iberia is fast becoming Carthage's new heartland. Both republics have adapted and evolved, learning hard lessons from the previous war. Both nurture new generations of commanders, soldiers, and ambitions. And beneath this stillness, the seeds of the next conflict are already germinating. In Iberia, Hannibal Barca matures into a leader shaped by hardship and driven by the legacy of his father. In Rome, the Senate debates how to secure the Republic's growing empire and anticipates dangers beyond the horizon. The peace that followed the First Punic War is, in truth, not a peace at all. It is an interlude, a pause between storms. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage, shaped by geography and destiny, is far from over. What lies ahead will eclipse everything that came before. Hannibal's oath and the march to war. As the years passed, the uneasy peace between Rome and Carthage stretched thin, taut like a rope fraying under the weight of ambition and resentment. On the surface, there was quiet. Rome administered its new provinces in Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, while Carthage expanded westward, turning its attention to Iberia's rugged mountains and rich mines. But beneath this calm veneer, an old wound still throbbed, a wound that no treaty could heal. In Carthage, the legacy of Hamilcar Barca lived on, not only in his conquests, but in the heart of his son, Hannibal. As a boy, Hannibal had followed his father through the campaigns in Iberia, watching as Carthage rebuilt itself, one conquered tribe and silver ingot at a time. By the late 220s BCE, that determination was embodied in Hannibal himself. After the death of Hasdrubal the Fair, Hannibal, now in his mid-20s, assumed command of Carthage's forces in Iberia. Tall, charismatic, and already battle-hardened, he quickly earned the loyalty of both Carthaginian officers and Iberian warriors. His reputation grew not just as a soldier, but as a leader who shared hardships with his men, who inspired fierce devotion, and who harbored an unrelenting enmity for Rome. His opportunity would come soon. In the treaty signed after the First Punic War, Carthage had agreed to respect the independence of certain Iberian towns, notably Saguntum, a wealthy, strategically placed city that had allied itself with Rome despite lying south of the Ebro River, the boundary set by the treaty. In Hannibal's eyes, Saguntum represented more than a rebellious neighbor. It was a symbol of Roman interference, a dagger aimed at Carthage's burgeoning Iberian Empire. Tensions rose steadily. Rome issued warnings. Saguntum emboldened its defenses. And then in 219 BCE, Hannibal acted. Without fanfare, he marched south from his capital at New Carthage and laid siege to Saguntum. For 8 relentless months, his army battered the city's walls, repelling desperate sorties and enduring counterattacks. The siege became a test of will. Saguntum's citizens fought valiantly, while Hannibal's army pressed its assault with characteristic persistence. Meanwhile, Rome, distracted by conflicts elsewhere in Illyria and preoccupied with managing its growing territories, hesitated. Appeals for help from Saguntum went unanswered, trapped in the slow machinery of the Senate's deliberations. By the time Rome resolved to act, it was too late. Saguntum fell, its inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved. The flames of its burning home sent a clear signal across the sea. Carthage, under Hannibal, was ready to challenge Rome once more, and so began the Second Punic War. Yet this war would not be like the last. Rome expected that Hannibal would behave as Carthaginian generals before him had done, defend Iberia, fortify North Africa, and prepare for a protracted conflict close to home. But Hannibal harbored a far more audacious plan, one that would define him as a commander for all time. He would bring the war to Italy itself. His march, one of the most daring and celebrated in history, began in the spring of 218 BCE. Hannibal gathered an army of approximately 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and nearly 40 war elephants. From New Carthage, they moved northward along the Iberian coast, subduing or negotiating with tribes along the way. As they reached the Pyrenees, Hannibal left a portion of his forces behind to secure supply lines and quell any uprisings in his rear. The army that crossed the mountains was smaller, but more determined. Their journey took them across hostile terrain, through uncertain passes, and into the lands of Gallic tribes who watched this Carthaginian force with suspicion and awe. Hannibal's march was not merely a military maneuver. It was a feat of leadership and endurance. The logistics alone, feeding, supplying, and maintaining discipline among an army so far from home, would have daunted lesser men. But Hannibal pressed forward. By late autumn, his army approached the Alps. The Romans, who regarded these towering mountains as an impenetrable barrier protecting Italy's northern flank, could scarcely imagine that an enemy might attempt such a crossing. Hannibal's plan, however, depended precisely on this disbelief. The Alpine crossing has become legend. Men and animals picking their way along narrow, icy trails, avalanches and rock slides claiming lives, bitter cold sapping strength and morale. Polybius, who later retraced Hannibal's path, described the ordeal in vivid detail, how the army struggled to climb treacherous slopes, how mules and elephants slid to their deaths, how entire units were lost to blizzards and ambushes by mountain tribes. Yet despite staggering losses, perhaps half his original force, Hannibal emerged on the plains of northern Italy before winter's onset, leading a hardened, battle-ready army of approximately 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a handful of surviving elephants. The audacity of the march stunned Rome. The Senate scrambled to organize defenses as news spread that an enemy army was not just approaching, but already on Italian soil. But Hannibal's arrival was only the beginning. Even as he descended into the Po Valley, his strategic mind remained sharp. He sought alliances with Gallic tribes long resentful of Roman expansion. These tribes, inspired by Hannibal's daring and eager for revenge, flocked to his banner, swelling his ranks. Hannibal's understanding of war was not confined to battles alone. He understood the politics of the Italian peninsula and aimed to fracture Rome's network of alliances, a strategy as bold as his march itself. Rome's initial attempts to block his advance met with disaster. At the Battle of the Ticinus, Hannibal's cavalry outmaneuvered and defeated Roman forces, forcing a retreat. Shortly thereafter, at the Trebia River, he lured another Roman army into an ambush, destroying it with characteristic tactical brilliance. And so, within months of his arrival, Hannibal had already inflicted 2 sharp defeats upon Rome, inspiring fear in the Senate and panic among the population. The true scope of Hannibal's campaign was only beginning to emerge. The Second Punic War had begun not with a declaration from Carthage's council, but with the oath of a son avenging his father's unfinished struggle. It was a war driven by personal vendetta and strategic daring, a war in which Hannibal would attempt to break Rome, not by storming its walls, but by unraveling its alliances and exhausting its will to fight. In the shadows of the Alps, with winter settling upon Italy, a new chapter of history was being written, a chapter in which Rome would face its most dangerous enemy yet, and where the fate of both republics hung in the balance. The Mediterranean, which had seemed to breathe easy in the years of peace, now braced itself once more. The contest between Rome and Carthage was far from over. It had only just begun again. The shadow of Cannae. By the spring of 217 BCE, Hannibal's arrival in Italy had transformed what had begun as a border dispute into a full-scale crisis for Rome. The defeats at Ticinus and Trebia were bitter blows to Roman pride, but they were also warnings. Hannibal was not merely a general from a distant land. He was a master of maneuver and deception, capable of turning Rome's strengths into weaknesses. And yet Rome's response was characteristically resolute. The Senate, battered but unbowed, raised new legions and entrusted them to Gaius Flaminius, a consul known for his impetuosity and disdain for caution. His task was clear: intercept Hannibal before he could penetrate deeper into Italy's heartland. But Hannibal had anticipated this. The Carthaginian army moved with uncanny speed, slipping through mountain passes and devastating the fertile lands of Etruria. His campaign was as much psychological as it was military. Every village sacked, every Roman ally persuaded to defect, chipped away at Rome's confidence and prestige. At Lake Trasimene, Flaminius rushed headlong into Hannibal's trap. There, in the mists of early morning, Hannibal deployed his troops in hidden positions along the narrow path between the lake and the hills. Flaminius, eager to engage, marched his legions into the ambush. The result was devastating. Nearly the entire Roman force was annihilated, and Flaminius himself fell in battle. News of the disaster reached Rome like a thunderclap. The Senate, reeling from yet another catastrophe, turned to an ancient solution: the appointment of a dictator, a leader granted absolute power for the duration of the emergency. Their choice was Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius was a man of experience and gravity, a contrast to the rashness of Flaminius. His strategy, soon to be known as Fabian tactics, was radical in its restraint. Avoid pitched battle, shadow Hannibal's movements, and wear down his army through attrition and harassment. To many Romans, this cautious approach felt humiliating. They longed for revenge, for the clash of legions and the restoration of honor. But Fabius understood something profound. Hannibal thrived on boldness. He sought to draw Rome into open conflict, to exploit his superior cavalry and tactical brilliance. Denying him that opportunity was itself a form of resistance. And so the summer of 217 BCE passed in a strange, intense dance. Hannibal pillaged and plundered through southern Italy, but Rome refused to give battle. Wherever Hannibal moved, Fabius followed, denying him supply and slowing his advance. Still, not all Romans shared Fabius' patience. By 216 BCE, the Senate, frustrated by Fabian tactics, transferred command to two new consuls: Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a cautious veteran, and Gaius Terentius Varro, a populist eager for glory. Together they raised the largest army Rome had ever assembled, estimated at nearly 80,000 men, and marched south to confront Hannibal near the small town of Cannae, along the banks of the Aufidus River. Hannibal, too, understood the significance of what was to come. The plain of Cannae offered ideal terrain for his cavalry and for the execution of a plan that would soon become legendary. In the early morning light of August 2nd, 216 BCE, the two armies faced one another. The Roman force, arrayed in a deep, dense formation, intended to overwhelm Hannibal through sheer weight of numbers. Hannibal's army was smaller, perhaps half the size of Rome's, but carefully positioned. His infantry formed a crescent, bulging forward in the center, while his cavalry guarded both flanks. As battle commenced, the Roman legions surged forward, pressing into the Carthaginian center. Hannibal's infantry gave ground deliberately, drawing the Roman mass deeper into the trap. It was then that Hannibal's cavalry, led by his brilliant commander Maharbal, struck. On both flanks, they routed the Roman horsemen and swung behind the Roman infantry, closing the trap. Simultaneously, the Carthaginian wings folded inward, encircling the Roman corps. What followed was slaughter. Crushed on all sides with no room to maneuver, the Roman army was systematically cut down. Polybius, writing later, estimated that nearly 50,000 Romans perished that day, a scale of loss unimaginable even by Roman standards. Among the dead were Consul Paulus, scores of senators, tribunes, and some of Rome's best officers. Cannae was not merely a defeat, it was a catastrophe. In Rome, despair gripped the city. Families mourned sons, fathers, brothers. The Senate prepared for siege, fearing that Hannibal would march directly on the capital itself. But Hannibal did not advance. Why he chose not to attack Rome after Cannae has been debated by historians for centuries. Perhaps he lacked the siege equipment. Perhaps he believed Rome would come to him with terms of peace. Or perhaps he judged rightly that defeating Rome's armies was not the same as breaking its spirit. For Rome's spirit remained unbroken. In the days that followed Cannae, the Senate passed extraordinary measures to rebuild. They conscripted boys as young as 17. They armed slaves and criminals. They conducted religious rites, seeking favor from the gods, but they never sued for peace. And Fabius Maximus, now vindicated, quietly resumed his strategy: shadow, harass, deny. Meanwhile, Hannibal sought to capitalize on his victory by persuading Rome's Italian allies to defect. Some did. Capua, the second city of Italy, opened its gates to him. Other regions wavered, tempted by Hannibal's success. But Rome's network of alliances, painstakingly built over generations, held together better than Hannibal had hoped. The city's resilience astonished even its enemies. Historians like Livy would later describe the period after Cannae as Rome's finest hour, not because of triumph, but because of endurance. In the face of devastating loss, Rome chose not surrender, but resistance. Modern scholars, too, see Cannae as a defining moment in the war. Adrian Goldsworthy writes of Rome's ability to absorb defeat, to adapt, and to fight on as a hallmark of what made the Republic so formidable. Richard Miles reflects on how Hannibal, though brilliant in battle, could not replicate Rome's capacity for regeneration, a factor that would ultimately decide the war's outcome. The shadow of Cannae looms over both Rome and Hannibal. For the Romans, it became a symbol of sacrifice and the high cost of defiance. For Hannibal, it was the pinnacle of his campaign, a battle that cemented his reputation but failed to deliver the final victory he sought. The Second Punic War continued, grim and grinding. Rome's legions would learn from their failures, grow stronger, and prepare to strike back. The Mediterranean remained restless. And even as Rome licked its wounds and Hannibal consolidated his hold on southern Italy, both sides understood the contest between them was far from settled. It was entering its next and most grueling phase. The Long War of Attrition. In the aftermath of Cannae's terrible slaughter, a strange silence settled over Italy. Both Rome and Hannibal paused, not from peace but from exhaustion. Rome reeled from the scale of her losses, and Hannibal, though triumphant on the battlefield, found that ultimate victory remained elusive. His greatest gamble had not broken Rome's resolve. Instead, it tested the very fabric of the Republic and revealed a deeper truth about its character. For while many expected Rome to collapse after Cannae, the Senate did not waver. Families who had lost sons sent their younger children to serve. Senators who had escaped death at Cannae redoubled their efforts to organize defense and supply lines. The Roman state, hardened by past crises, fell back on its most enduring quality: resilience. As 215 BCE dawned, Hannibal turned his attention to diplomacy, seeking to dismantle Rome's alliance network in Italy. Some cities shaken by the Roman defeats defected to his side, most notably Capua, the wealthy second city of Italy, whose gates now opened to Hannibal's army. Hannibal made Capua his winter headquarters, offering it as proof that Rome could not protect its allies. But for every ally lost, Rome responded with patient determination. The Senate deployed garrisons to loyal towns, fortified critical points, and worked tirelessly to hold the Italian Confederation together. The Fabian strategy, avoid decisive battles, harass supply lines, and slowly bleed the enemy, returned to the forefront. And while Italy became the heart of the struggle, the war's frontiers widened. In Sicily, the death of Hero II, Rome's steadfast ally in Syracuse, emboldened a pro-Carthaginian faction to seize control of the city. Hannibal's influence stretched even across the straits, inspiring rebellion. But Rome, aware of Sicily's strategic importance, dispatched one of its finest generals, Marcus Claudius Marcellus. Marcellus was a contrast to Fabius. Where Fabius embodied caution, Marcellus represented action. Known as the Sword of Rome, he moved swiftly to contain the Sicilian revolt, besieging Syracuse itself. The siege became famous not only for its violence, but for the strange interplay of war and science. As Archimedes, the city's resident genius, devised machines that hurled stones, fire, and destruction upon the Roman forces. Yet even Archimedes' brilliance could not save Syracuse. After a protracted siege, Roman troops stormed the city. Syracuse fell. Archimedes was killed, despite Roman orders to spare him, and Sicily was restored to Roman control. Meanwhile, Carthage sought to open new fronts elsewhere. In 215 BCE, it forged an alliance with Philip V of Macedon, king of one of Greece's most powerful states. The Macedonian king, eager to expand his influence westward, agreed to attack Rome's Adriatic coast. But Roman diplomacy, skillful, relentless, neutralized the threat. By 201 BCE, Rome had orchestrated alliances with Greek cities and other regional powers, diverting Philip's attention back to Greece itself. Thus, the Macedonian front collapsed before it could truly begin. And while these distant theaters played out, another battleground was becoming decisive: Iberia. It was in Iberia that the Roman Republic identified the key to breaking Carthage's will. Iberia was not merely a distant colony, it had become Carthage's economic lifeline, a source of soldiers, silver, and supplies. In 218 BCE, even as Hannibal began his march into Italy, Rome dispatched the brothers Gnaeus and Publius Cornelius Scipio to Iberia. Their task was simple in theory, daunting in practice: attack Hannibal's base of power and cut off his reinforcements. For years, the Scipio brothers waged a grinding campaign along Iberia's rugged coasts and plains. Battles were fought, towns besieged, alliances made and broken. Carthaginian generals in Iberia, Hasdrubal, Mago, and others, matched Roman skill with cunning and ferocity. But gradually, Roman persistence bore fruit. Even as Hannibal fought in Italy, his lifeline in Iberia began to fray. In 201 BCE, the war reached a pivotal moment. Both Scipio brothers were killed in battle, ambushed by a Carthaginian coalition. For a moment, Rome's hold in Iberia seemed lost. But Rome's resilience once again asserted itself. The Senate appointed a young commander to take up the cause, a man who would, in time, surpass even Hannibal in fame and accomplishment: Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son of the fallen general. At just 25 years old, Scipio inherited a fragile position, yet he moved with remarkable speed and confidence. In 209 BCE, he launched a daring assault on New Carthage itself, the jewel of Carthaginian Iberia. Scipio's attack was swift and devastating. The city fell, its harbor seized, its walls breached. Carthage's Iberian empire was mortally wounded. From this point on, Scipio's campaigns in Iberia would systematically dismantle Carthaginian power there, denying Hannibal the reinforcements he so desperately needed in Italy. Back on the Italian peninsula, Hannibal's position, once so commanding, began to erode. Though he still commanded respect and fear, he could not break Rome's alliances or compel a decisive surrender. His requests for reinforcements from Carthage met with delays, hesitation, and excuses. Years passed and the balance slowly but surely tipped. Even Capua, Hannibal's proud prize, could not hold. In 201 BCE, after a brutal siege, Roman forces retook the city, punishing its leaders harshly and sending a grim message to any Italian town that contemplated rebellion. And so, by 207 BCE, the war had become one of attrition in the truest sense. Rome continued to replenish its armies, while Hannibal, far from home, struggled to replace his losses. At the Metaurus River that year, Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother, attempted to bring reinforcements from Iberia, but was intercepted and decisively defeated by Roman forces. Hasdrubal fell in battle, and in a grim gesture, his severed head was thrown into Hannibal's camp as a warning. The message was unmistakable. Hannibal stood alone. The contours of the conflict are becoming clear. The war that had begun with a daring march over the Alps had become a slow, grinding contest of endurance, resources, and willpower. Rome's ability to fight on multiple fronts, to recover from disaster, to outlast crisis, was proving decisive. Its Senate, citizens, and generals had evolved over the course of the war, adapting to the threat that Hannibal posed. And Hannibal himself, brilliant but increasingly isolated, faced a harsh truth. Italy was a battleground he could dominate tactically, but could not conquer politically. Rome's allies, battered and tempted, had largely held firm. The Mediterranean world watched and waited, knowing that this long struggle was nearing its climax. The war had reshaped two great powers, tested the limits of endurance, and rewritten the art of strategy. And soon both Rome and Carthage would be forced into a final reckoning, one last campaign that would decide not only the fate of armies, but the destiny of empires. The fall of Carthage's dream. By the early 200s BCE, after nearly 2 decades of war, the tide had irrevocably turned. The proud, confident Carthaginian, thrust into Italy, so audacious under Hannibal's genius, was now a weary, isolated campaign. Rome's tenacity had proven stronger than Carthage's daring. Even as Hannibal still roamed southern Italy, his hopes for reinforcement and decisive victory were fading into shadows. Far away in Iberia, Carthage's empire had crumbled under the leadership of Publius Cornelius Scipio, the young Roman general who would come to be known as Scipio Africanus. His victory at Aleppo in 206 BCE had shattered the last significant Carthaginian forces in Spain. The silver mines, the fertile plains, the manpower, all now fed the Roman war machine instead. With Iberia lost, Carthage's influence shrank to its ancestral heartland in North Africa, and Scipio, always bold, saw his opportunity. His plan was audacious. Rather than continue fighting Hannibal in Italy, Rome would strike at Carthage itself. The Senate hesitated at first. The memory of Cannae's carnage still haunted them, and many feared Hannibal might yet march on Rome itself. But Scipio's reputation, his proven brilliance in Spain, and his charismatic leadership swayed opinion. The Senate entrusted him with an army, not vast, but carefully chosen, and in 204 BCE, Scipio set sail for Africa. There he forged alliances with local Numidian leaders, including Massinissa, a young prince who saw in Rome a means to secure his own ambitions. With Numidian cavalry joining his ranks, Scipio quickly seized the initiative, capturing towns, defeating Carthaginian field armies, and threatening the very outskirts of Carthage itself. Carthage, desperate, called for its greatest son to return. And so, after 16 years in Italy, Hannibal Barca was recalled home. His march southward was a melancholy journey. Hannibal had carved a legend on Italian soil, victories that would echo for centuries. But now he returned not as a conqueror, but as Carthage's final hope. When he arrived in 203 BCE, he found a Carthage weary and diminished, no longer the confident maritime empire that had once challenged Rome for Sicily and mastery of the Mediterranean. Even so, the city's faith in Hannibal was unwavering. Once more he assembled an army, not the veterans who had marched with him across the Alps, but new recruits, hastily raised and trained. Among them were African levies, mercenaries, and a small contingent of war elephants. The two great generals, Scipio and Hannibal, now prepared for their final reckoning. Their armies met on the plains of Zama in 202 BCE. It was a fitting stage, flat, open terrain that favored cavalry maneuver, the very element in which both commanders excelled. But this time, Scipio held the advantage. He had studied Hannibal's tactics, learned from Rome's earlier defeats, and forged a coalition army that included large contingents of Numidian cavalry, forces that would finally allow Rome to meet and exceed Hannibal's mastery of mounted warfare. Before battle, according to tradition, the two generals met face to face, an encounter described by later historians as both somber and profound. Hannibal, seasoned and weary, proposed peace on moderate terms, but Scipio, confident and clear-eyed, refused. The fate of their nations would be decided not by negotiation, but by battle. At Zama, Hannibal deployed his war elephants first, hoping to break Rome's infantry lines as they had done in battles past. But Scipio's legions calmly opened ranks, creating lanes through which the panicked animals harmlessly passed. Then came the infantry clash, ferocious and determined on both sides. At the decisive moment, Scipio unleashed his Numidian cavalry. They swept around the flanks, routed Hannibal's own horsemen, and charged into the rear of the Carthaginian line. Encircled and exhausted, Hannibal's army broke. The battle was over. Carthage's power was broken, finally, utterly. The peace that followed was harsh, as Rome intended. Carthage surrendered its fleet, its empire, and its future as an independent power. Heavy tribute was imposed, and Carthage was forbidden from waging war without Rome's permission. Scipio, honored for his victory, took the title Africanus, a name that would forever link his triumph to the continent where Carthage's dreams had come to their end. For Hannibal, defeat did not mean surrender of spirit. He returned to Carthage and, for a time, served as a statesman, reforming the city's finances and administration. But Rome, ever watchful, soon demanded his exile. Hannibal fled eastward, spending his final years at the courts of foreign kings, still scheming against Rome, still seeking ways to strike at the republic that had humbled his homeland. In 183 BCE, cornered by Roman emissaries, he chose death over capture, ending his life by poison at the age of 65. His death marked not only the end of an extraordinary life, but the close of a defining chapter in Mediterranean history. Rome, which began the Punic Wars as a rising regional power, now stood supreme across the western Mediterranean. Carthage, once a mighty empire of merchants, sailors, and warriors, was reduced to a client state. Its glory dimmed, its future dictated by Rome. But Hannibal's legacy endured. His campaigns would be studied by generals for centuries. Napoleon, Wellington, and even modern strategists would look to his maneuvers for inspiration. His daring march over the Alps, his mastery of ambush and encirclement, and his defiance in the face of overwhelming odds all became part of the legend of leadership and military genius. Rome, too, had been changed, not only stronger, but wiser. Its legions had learned the price of hubris and the value of adaptation. The Punic Wars had forged the Republic into an empire in all but name, with provinces, tributaries, and influence stretching from Spain to Asia Minor. The rivalry that had once centered on Sicily and trade routes had become something far greater, a contest for supremacy itself. The struggles between Rome and Carthage would linger as a cautionary tale of ambition, endurance, brilliance, and loss. The Mediterranean, at last, lay quiet once more. But beneath its still surface, the currents of empire, memory, and destiny continued to flow. The road to the final war. The long shadow of the Second Punic War stretched over the Mediterranean like a lingering storm. Though Rome had emerged victorious at Zama in 202 BCE and Carthage lay humbled, the peace imposed by Scipio Africanus was far from healing. It was a peace born of exhaustion, of battered armies and drained treasuries, but beneath its surface old resentments simmered. Carthage, stripped of its empire, its fleet, and its overseas possessions, clung to life on the North African coast. Yet even reduced, its resilience was remarkable. Within a generation, Carthage transformed itself into a prosperous trading hub once more. Its merchants reclaimed lost markets, its artisans crafted wares prized across the sea, and its harbors bustled with activity. The bitter tribute imposed by Rome was paid on schedule, year after year without rebellion or delay. In Rome, this recovery did not go unnoticed, and it bred unease. For many Romans, memories of Hannibal remained vivid and raw. The sack of farms in Italy, the slaughter at Cannae, and the long years of fear had left scars that no peace treaty could erase. Among the Senate, voices grew louder, warning that Carthage was rising again, that its wealth would surely fund new armies, new fleets, and a future revenge. No voice was louder or more relentless than that of Cato the Elder. Marcus Porcius Cato, a stern and uncompromising senator, had fought in the Second Punic War and carried its traumas with him. To Cato, Carthage's prosperity was not a symbol of peace restored, but a threat reborn. Every speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of topic, ended with the same chilling refrain: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. His words echoed through the marble halls of Rome's political life, infecting the Senate with paranoia and resolve. Though some senators argued for restraint, pointing out that Carthage had adhered faithfully to the peace terms, Cato's persistence gradually tipped the balance. Across the sea, Carthage's leaders sensed Rome's growing hostility but felt trapped. The treaty after Zama had placed them in an impossible position. They could not go to war without Rome's approval, but they could not guarantee their safety without defending themselves. This dilemma became acute when a third player entered the scene: Numidia. Under its ambitious king, Massinissa, Numidia had grown into a powerful state on Carthage's borders. Massinissa, once Rome's ally in the fight against Hannibal, now turned his ambitions toward carving away Carthaginian territory. He launched raids, seized farmland, and encroached steadily, claiming that his ancestors had once ruled these lands. Carthage, bound by treaty, appealed to Rome for justice. Rome's response was silence, deliberate and chilling. The Senate had no interest in restraining Massinissa. Every Numidian incursion weakened Carthage further, eroding its resources and sapping its spirit. Eventually, Carthage could bear no more. In the 150s BCE, after decades of humiliation, a faction in Carthage's government finally defied the treaty's terms and raised arms against Numidia. Though they achieved little militarily, the symbolic breach gave Rome the pretext it had long desired. Rome's response was swift and unequivocal: war. In 149 BCE, the Senate declared that Carthage must submit completely. When Carthaginian envoys arrived in Rome, hoping for leniency, they were met with impossible demands. Carthage must disarm entirely, surrender hostages, and accept complete Roman oversight. Carthage, desperate to avoid destruction, agreed. But then came the final, crushing ultimatum. Carthage itself must be abandoned and rebuilt inland, far from the sea. This demand struck at the very soul of Carthage. For a city whose identity was entwined with the sea, whose harbors had made her rich and proud, this was tantamount to erasure. The Senate of Carthage debated fiercely. Some counseled submission, arguing that survival, however diminished, was preferable to annihilation. But a bolder voice rose in the assembly: Carthage would stand and fight. Thus, as 149 BCE dawned, Rome prepared its legions for invasion, and Carthage once again girded itself for war, not as the empire it had once been, but as a city defending its very existence. The Third Punic War had begun. The Mediterranean's restless waves lapped against Carthage's harbor walls as its citizens took up arms. Old men sharpened blades, youths trained in the narrow streets, and women wove slings and prepared provisions. The entire city braced itself for siege. Yet there was a somber understanding among them. They knew this war would be different. This time, Rome did not seek tribute or territorial concessions. It sought finality, a war of annihilation, driven by memory, fear, and Cato's enduring refrain. Even so, the spirit of Carthage remained unbowed. Rome's legions are crossing the sea. Carthage's walls rise defiant against the horizon, and a conflict long in the making is ready to explode. Soon the final confrontation would begin, not merely a war for supremacy, but a struggle for existence itself. The destruction of Carthage. In 149 BCE, Roman legions set sail for Africa with grim determination. This was no campaign of conquest or tribute. It was an expedition designed for finality. For decades, Carthage had been humbled, constrained, and watched. Now Rome intended to erase its rival from the map, once and for all. Carthage, though diminished, stood defiant. Along its harbor quays and behind its massive triple walls, the city prepared for a siege unlike any before. Craftsmen forged weapons from household tools. Women and children carried stones to strengthen battlements. Even elders who remembered Hannibal's glories took up duties to aid the defense. The Romans landed unopposed on the African shore. Their general, the consul Manius Manilius, expected a swift victory. But as his forces approached Carthage's walls, they met a city determined to survive. And so began a siege that would stretch not for weeks, but for years. The Carthaginian spirit was fierce. Inside the walls, the people transformed their entire society into a war effort. Every able-bodied citizen fought or worked to support the fighters. Even as Roman siege engines battered the outer defenses, Carthaginian sorties harassed supply lines, captured Roman engineers, and burned siege works in daring night raids. The Romans, too, struggled. Disease swept their camps. Supplies from Sicily were often delayed or lost at sea. Roman impatience turned to frustration as the vaunted city refused to fall. Year after year, Carthage endured. In 147 BCE, recognizing the stalemate, Rome turned to one of its most brilliant young generals, Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus. Scipio Aemilianus brought order where chaos reigned. He restructured Roman logistics, enforced strict discipline in the camps, and reinvigorated the siege effort. His leadership restored morale and focus. The Roman army, under his command, slowly tightened its grip around Carthage like an iron band. But even Scipio could see that a conventional siege would take too long. Carthage's access to the sea allowed it to bring in some supplies by ship, prolonging its resistance. And so Scipio conceived a ruthless plan to cut the city off completely from the Mediterranean. Roman engineers labored day and night to construct a massive mole, a giant stone causeway stretching into the harbor mouth, designed to choke off all maritime traffic. Carthaginian defenders watched in horror as the structure advanced, rock by rock, closing their last vital lifeline. Yet Carthage would not surrender. In a display of ingenuity and desperation, its citizens built new warships within the very walls of the city, launching them in a sudden, furious sortie that caught the Romans by surprise. For a moment, it seemed as if Carthage might break the blockade, but Roman discipline and persistence prevailed. The hastily constructed Carthaginian fleet was destroyed, and the harbor finally sealed. Inside the city, famine began its cruel work. Grain ran out. Weakened by hunger, disease crept through the population. Children wasted away. The old and infirm died quietly. But still, the city resisted. Throughout these final months, the psychological pressure was immense. Romans outside the walls watched as Carthaginians turned to ever more desperate measures, grinding bones for flour, boiling leather for sustenance. Carthaginian resolve was reduced neither by hunger nor fear. Finally, in 146 BCE, after a siege of nearly 3 years, Scipio gave the order to storm the city itself. The final assault was brutal. Roman soldiers breached the outer defenses and began their grim advance through Carthage's narrow streets. House by house, block by block, the defenders fought with the desperation of those who knew there would be no mercy. Flames rose where barricades had been set alight. The cries of women and children mingled with the clash of steel and the crackle of burning timbers. Even as Carthaginian resistance was pushed back to the Byrsa, the city's citadel, there was no surrender. The Byrsa itself became a fortress within a fortress. Families retreated into temples, setting fire to themselves rather than fall into Roman hands. The Temple of Eshmun, where nobles and citizens had gathered, became a pyre as defenders set it alight from within. Scipio himself, watching the inferno engulf the citadel, is said to have wept, not from pity for his enemy, but from a chilling realization. As flames consumed Carthage, he quoted words from Homer. "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be no more." It was not only Carthage's fate he foresaw, it was the fate of all cities, even mighty Rome itself. When the slaughter was done, Carthage was no more. The surviving inhabitants, perhaps 50,000 souls out of hundreds of thousands, were marched into slavery. The once proud streets were razed, temples torn down, harbors dismantled. The Romans sowed salt into the soil according to legend, not so much to poison the earth, but as a ritual act symbolizing that nothing should rise again from Carthage's ashes. The province of Africa was created, ruled directly from Rome, with Utica, not Carthage, as its administrative center. The war was over, but the story of Carthage would endure. In the quiet aftermath, as Roman soldiers camped among the ruins, a profound stillness fell over the harbor where once proud Phoenician ships had set sail. The city that had rivaled Rome for mastery of the Mediterranean, that had given the world Hannibal, that had endured defeat and rebuilt, was gone. But Carthage left behind more than ruins. The struggle between Rome and Carthage became an enduring symbol of ambition and rivalry, of resilience and tragedy, of civilizations locked in competition. Generals and emperors for centuries to come would study the Punic Wars. The lessons of Cannae, the audacity of Hannibal, the discipline of Rome's legions, and the ferocity of Carthage's final defense would inspire countless leaders. And in Carthage's destruction, Rome too was changed. No longer merely a republic of farmers and senators, Rome was now the unquestioned master of the Western Mediterranean, an empire in all but name. Yet in that mastery lay the seeds of future challenges. For as Scipio Aemilianus foresaw amid the ashes, all empires, even Rome's, carry within them the destiny of eventual decline. In the stillness that follows ruin, only echoes remain, of walls that once defied armies, of streets now silent beneath drifting ash, and of a proud city brought to its knees. Carthage had fallen, not with a sudden blow, but under the slow, grinding weight of Roman will. And beyond the shattered gates, the Mediterranean endured, eternal and unmoved, its waves whispering against the bones of a vanished empire. The Punic Wars had finally ended, not merely in a treaty, but in total obliteration. The conflict that had shaped a century of history had come to its close. The Mediterranean belonged to Rome, and yet history reminds us, even the most absolute victories are but moments in the long, unending tide of time. And now as we leave behind the story of Rome and Carthage, a story of ambition, courage, rivalry, and loss, let us pause in the quiet that follows. For more than a century, two mighty civilizations had struggled for dominance across the blue waters of the Mediterranean. Their battles shaped the fate of nations, their victories and defeats altering the map of the ancient world. But beyond legions and fleets, beyond generals and kings, this was always a human story of merchants and farmers, soldiers and citizens, whose lives were swept into the tides of history. Carthage, once a proud maritime empire, now lay in ruins, its people scattered, its harbors silent. Rome, triumphant and ascendant, began its transformation from a republic of citizen soldiers into the vast empire that would one day rule much of the known world. Yet as Scipio Aemilianus himself reflected amid the ashes of Carthage, all empires rise and fall. No city, however mighty, is beyond the reach of time's patient hand. As the waves of history grow still, may this story rest gently in your mind. May you find in it not only the grandeur of great events, but also the quiet reminder that even amidst struggle, there is dignity, and that after every storm, calm will return. Now let your thoughts drift as gently as the Mediterranean breeze that once carried ships between Rome and Carthage. And as the past fades softly into memory, may you slip peacefully into sleep.